Red light. Lee's eyes dropped to the ground at the sound of the first syllable. For good measure, he kept both of his eyelids screwed shut. All around him came the sound of inhuman wailing and the screams of the other players. Those who'd closed their eyes or looked away just a moment too late started running for their lives. Someone shoulder barged Lee, sending him sprawling. As his body hit the ground, he fought against his natural instinct to open his eyes and see the person who'd done it. Instead, he curled himself up, arms protecting his head and face against the stampede. The ones who were running couldn't get out, no matter how they might have tried in vain to escape. The only way out was to play by the rules, and they'd just lost. The last stomach-turning snap of a neck silenced the frantic yells of the player, but still Lee forced himself to keep his eyes closed. Someone nearby had clearly looked too soon, resulting in an extra screech from the creature, only ending once it had killed this overeager player. Green light. The voice over the intercom squawked, and Lee cautiously opened his eyes. Around him was a sea of bodies in similar orange jumpsuits to the one he wore, emblazoned with the SCP Foundation's logo and a contestant number. There looked to already be upwards of 50 people lying dead on the ground. At the far end of the room, with its back to those still standing, was a tall humanoid creature. Its hands covered its face as it sobbed. A metal cable on a winch was attached to a collar around its neck, designed to reel it back in and stand facing the wall. For now, Lee started to move. The room was massive, easily the length of a football field, maybe longer. The other surviving players had gotten the same idea, some rushing forward to make it to the opposite wall. The rules had stated they needed to make it across in 5 minutes, but looking at the creature's face would disqualify them from the game, and from life. Several huge screens displayed that they only had a few minutes left, but by now Lee had learned not to trust them. At any moment, when red light was next called, they'd flash an image of the creature's face on screen, a horrific screaming monster with a mouth too wide and its limbs overgrown. Not that Lee had seen it for himself. The creature seemed to have some adverse reaction to its face being observed, and moved at impossible speeds across the field to kill those who had seen it. Red light. In an instant, Lee had stopped still and crouched down, keeping his eyes shut, arms curled around his head. He tried to surround himself with darkness in the faint hope he could keep even the tiniest sight of the creature out. A short distance away, watching the events on the field unfold, a group of oligarchs scoffed up at a series of huge monitors that displayed the game. The images were strategically blurred, with a pixelated filter over SCP-096 as the metal cable keeping it in place suddenly slackened, and it was free to enter its rage state. It shot across the field, killing the members of D-Class that had seen it. It was actually moving at such a speed that the cable itself became a danger. It swept across the playing field behind SCP-096, accidentally taking out additional players thanks to its tension. One of the contestants was split in half, severed through the waist, separating their upper and lower halves, much to the twisted amusement of the wealthy onlookers. Those who had crouched out of path of the cable or dropped themselves prone to the ground were the only ones safe from decapitation, and the shy guy. Green light. Instead of waiting this time, Lee stood up and started moving, not running but steadily walking, while still keeping his eyes covered. He knew he'd be facing the opposite wall. All he had to do was move in that direction, while being careful if he felt the bodies of any other contestants in the path of his steps. Red light. It was quicker this time, but Lee didn't stop. The sound of the metal cable twanging caught his ear, and he immediately dropped, front down on the ground. He started crawling forwards on his stomach towards the other end of the playing field. Behind him he heard SCP-096 taking care of the unluckier contestants, before the sound of the creature breathing seemed to appear behind him. The shy guy was towering over him, spattered with blood as it looked confusedly down at him. He was still moving, but he hadn't seen the creature's face. He was just playing by the rules. Green light. Continuing forward, Lee afforded himself a peek. He was a short dash from the wall now, clambering back to his feet and sprinting over, alongside several other D-Class contestants. As they ran to the far side of the field, Lee yelled at them to face the wall, expecting to hear one final call of red light. Sure enough, the shy guy was let loose once more and sped over to the other contestants, still trying to close the remaining gap between them and the far wall. Keeping his head against the wall, his gaze downwards and his eyes clamped shut, Lee covered his ears, though it did little to drown out the agonizing screams. The SCP Foundation's newest venture had netted it an obscene level of additional funding from their many new benefactors. A notably overzealous member of the finance department had developed a strategy wherein the Foundation could leverage its two greatest assets, these being contained anomalies and D-class personnel, into enough profit to sustain their operations indefinitely. The idea involved putting members of D-class through a series of challenges based around playground games for children. The catch was, these games would involve various SCPs, designed to make it harder for the contestants to succeed. And in order to ensure the Foundation would receive monetary benefits, a number of the world's wealthiest oligarchs and CEOs were invited to view the games live, place bets on their outcomes, or even donate to the Foundation in order to back the success of specific contestants. The Foundation's head of financial strategy was noted to have praised this proposal, considering it a brilliant and original idea that wasn't in any way derivative. The D-class contestants who had survived the initial challenge of playing red light green light against SCP-096 were soon herded into the next area of the testing facility that had been retrofitted into the arena for the games. Each one of them was handed a small tin by mobile task force operators, who were now acting as guards overseeing the D-class as they undertook each challenge. Opening up his tin, Lee looked inside to see what looked like a cookie, about 10 centimeters long and 5 wide, around a centimeter thick. He didn't recognize what it had been made to resemble, though he would later. It had been baked in the likeness of SCP-173, but it actually looked appealing, despite the circumstances. Before eating it though, Lee noticed everyone else had been handed a similar cookie. Through the intercom overhead, the rules were announced. This was to be a variation on the game Dalgona. The contestants had only 2 minutes to eat their provided cookies in their entirety without biting their tongues. Anyone that did would be eliminated by the MTF guards. The challenge sounded easy, too easy to be true, though that didn't stop some from immediately shoveling their cookies down the moment the timer started. These contestants quickly found themselves on the receiving end of a nasty surprise. These weren't ordinary cookies. Each one was an instance of a rare anomaly known as SCP-173-C. These anomalous cookies could twist the tongues of anyone who attempted to consume one, in such a way that they'd accidentally bite down on it. Contestants all around the room yelped in pain and howled streams of expletives. MTF operatives marched up to each one and opened fire, quickly silencing the unfortunate contestants in an instant. Thinking quickly, Lee took a hold of his cookie and crushed it up in the tin, until there was nothing more than a crumbled mess. He then began lapping at the crumbs, carefully making sure to swallow the crumbs that stuck to his tongue first, before taking another lick. Around him, others were attempting to break their cookies into smaller pieces, or chewing meticulously slowly, some nibbling tiny bites at a time, while the timer ticked on. Despite the pain sound of contestants accidentally biting their tongues, or the loud bang of the MTF's firearms, Lee focused solely on eating crumbs. He licked his tin clean just before the timer elapsed. Relieved, Lee had survived the second game, though the one that followed wouldn't have such a straightforward solution. That night, none of the contestants slept well. Having lived through 2 rounds of challenges that took a pretty literal definition of sudden death had been a brutally effective way of driving home the stakes of these games, and it weighed heavily on Lee's mind as he tossed and turned in the small bunk he was made to sleep on. The next morning, each of the contestants was handed what looked to be a printout of an email with the subject, "Pro tips to win at rock, paper, scissors," along with some mostly incoherent ramblings about the game and its supposed importance to human culture. The email contained an image of a man with 6 arms. He was performing the various gestures that correspond with rock, paper, and scissors, along with a series of additional unknown hand motions. This was the next game they'd be playing. Not rock, paper, scissors, but rock, paper, yogg, sothoth, otherwise known as SCP-4633. This alteration on the game involved additional anomalous hand gestures. Lee, still sleep-deprived from the restless night before, tried to scan through the unfamiliar gestures on the page. He He could barely even pronounce the names of them. They were all spelled out phonetically, like Azravok and Rakeshet, but didn't sound at all like any language he'd heard before. Lee had barely had a moment to examine the printout before the MTF guards started rounding up the D-class contestants. The guards snatched the pages from anyone that tried to sneak them into the game. The contestants were paired up at random upon reaching the next game room. Lee recognized the man he'd be partnered with, a number member of D-class who went by the name Park. The rules were once again given through the loudspeakers. To win, one contestant had to beat another at rock, paper, yogg, sothoth. From the moment the timer began, several pairings threw down the classic gestures, but others who had been quicker to memorize the information on the printouts they had been given started playing bizarre moves that Lee and Park couldn't help but stop and stare at. Someone threw down a gesture called Rakeshet, causing their thumb to enter the palm of one hand only to emerge from the thumbnail of the opposite hand, a move that beat their opponent's rock and secured victory. Another contestant played Shah Nak Nar against their opponent, causing their hand to turn inside out and reversing the usual pairings of the game. They threw down again and beat their opponent's rock with scissors. One D-class had been studying a particular gesture, Il Ar-Teth, and played it during a series of rapid ties against their opponent. Il Ar-Teth turned their hands into a mass of coral, which they then proceeded to use to beat the opposing contestant to death. The MTF guards didn't intervene. Apparently, this was allowed and encouraged under the rules of rock, paper, yogg, sothoth. The guards barked at Lee and Park, telling them they couldn't abstain from playing unless they wanted to forfeit and be executed along with the contestants that had lost their rounds. Park confessed he learned one of the gestures and that he knew what it would win against. Lee urged him not to use it, and instead told Park he'd tell him what he was about to play. This made his opponent skeptical. He had no reason to trust Lee's word, and announcing a move could well have been a misdirect. It seemed like Lee was hoping Park would play the same gesture and match him, so they could tie indefinitely until the guard stepped in and killed one of them. It wasn't the outcome either of them wanted, but at least this way they weren't flipping a coin to see which of them was responsible for the other's death. Rock. On the count of 3, sure enough, Lee played rock, and Park mirrored it. He wasn't even sure he meant to, or if he just matched whatever gesture Lee had said. They counted again and played a second round, paper. Again, their hands matched. Lee said nothing other than the move he intended to play. Park had the choice to match him or play a gesture that would win, yet he didn't. Perhaps he didn't want Lee's blood on his hands either, but it started to dawn on Park that this could have been a ploy. He had no reason to believe Lee would stay true to his word and actually throw down the gesture he said he would. Scissors. They mirrored each other a third time, and Park became more and more uncertain that his opponent would play honestly. This time, he thought. This time he played the gesture he learned. He knew it beat rock, and if Lee was just cycling through the classic 3 gestures, then this move would win the game. Rock. Park played his gesture, long spines suddenly prickling out of the back of his hand, piercing the skin and trailing all down his arm. Dozens of thin tendrils started glowing from the underside of his palm. He hadn't bothered to learn the name of the move, only that it would win against Lee's rock. But Lee had played paper. Park barely had time to feel anger at the misdirection before one of the guards pulled out a pistol and fired. The next game was set up much like the first, with the surviving D-class contestants herded into a new room like cattle. Rather than being made to take partners, the 50 or so people left alive were made to stand at one end of the room, while the MTF guards prepared something on the other side. This time, the play area was much more confined. They clearly weren't going to need to move around a lot for this game. The voice on the speakers announced the latest challenge, a staring contest against SCP-173. A shroud fell from the object the MTF soldiers had brought into the room. Immediately, Lee recognized it. The cookies from the second game. They looked just like this strange sculpture. From the moment it appeared, Lee kept his eyes on the spray-painted concrete and rebar statue, ignoring the brownish-red stains he saw in his peripheral vision. After a few seconds, he felt his eyes drying out. How could anyone win a staring contest against an inanimate object that physically couldn't blink? The answer came all too quick, when the sculpture seemed to vanish before everyone's eyes. Someone had blinked. Immediately, Lee began surveying the room, looking for SCP-173 amidst the crowd of other contestants. Screams of terror filled the space as, in the commotion, the unobserved anomaly broke the necks of the one that had looked away for a fraction of a second. The moment Lee's eyes and everyone else's fell over the sculpture again, it had already frozen in place. The bodies of the unlucky contestants who had blinked now littered the floor. The remainder of the game took the entire rest of the day. Fatigue started to take hold of Lee and the other remaining contestants, adding another level of difficulty to an already tough challenge. It became as much a competition of who could keep awake the longest as it was a contest to not break eye contact with SCP-173. When someone yawned or their eyelids became too heavy, their neck was snapped by the sculpture. The terror brought an added jolt of adrenaline to the remaining contestants, but the longer it went on, the more subsequent epinephrine boosts started to wane. By the time the klaxon sounded, signaling the end of the staring contest, there were no more than 10 D-Class left, including Lee. He was so exhausted, so tired, that he was barely able to stand up. He collapsed into his bunk, and it didn't matter how cramped and uncomfortable it was, Lee fell asleep immediately. The blaring alarms awoke him first thing the following morning. Lee and the other surviving contestants groggily pulled themselves out of bed, underprepared for the next game. Still, as they were led into a room resembling a gymnasium, and as the announcer explained the rules, it seemed that this would be at least one game they were all familiar with: dodgeball. An old Whammo brand red Super Ball from the late 60s was placed in the center of the room, one ball between two teams of 5. If anyone was hit with the ball, they would be out. If anyone caught the ball, then whoever threw it would be eliminated. The game started exactly as expected. Someone rushing for the ball, scooping it up, and immediately hurling it as hard as they could. It whacked one of the opposing team in the head with a loud thunk that echoed around the room, followed quickly by a sniper's deafening gunshot. The game continued, with most trying to avoid being hit by the incoming ball. Lee felt bad for those that it caught after glancing off a wall or bouncing off the floor. They would be executed for what seemed like little more than being in the path of the ball's random bouncing. As the team started to get whittled away one at a time, things started getting even more intense. Sweat dripped from Lee's brow, crawling unpleasantly down the back of his neck every time the ball was hurtled in his direction. One throw he saw coming and leapt up to catch the Super Ball in both hands, a move met with desperate screams and obscenities from the person who'd thrown it, but those noises were quickly silenced by a bullet. 2 teams of 5 had quickly become 2 of 3, then 2 pairs. Lee wasn't sure if his mind was playing tricks on him. Sure, he was physically exhausted from 3 grueling days of games, but he was positive the dodgeball was moving faster and faster each time it was thrown. Another pitch from the opposing duo seemed to confirm his suspicions. Lee dove out of the path of the oncoming ball a fraction of a second before it whipped past his head, bouncing off the wall with enough force to leave cracks on the surface. That was this game's catch. The ball was getting faster each time it bounced. The ball was SCP-018. Another throw struck Lee's teammate hard enough that they were knocked over. He was close enough to hear the muffled sound of their ribcage cracking right before the sniper opened fire. Picking it up when it rolled his way, Lee looked around the court, 2 opponents against him. The 3 of them were boxed in, surrounded by 4 walls. Pulling his arm back and hurling the Super Ball as hard as he could, Lee flung it not at the opposing duo, but at one of the walls. Sure enough, SCP-018 bounced and shot off the wall at incredible speeds, zipping across the room before colliding with the opposite wall. It kept going, moving faster and bouncing harder against every wall of the court. Then Lee did what he'd done during the first game, dove face down onto the ground, shut his eyes, and prayed. The ball was speeding around like a pinball, whizzing so fast that it had become a dangerous projectile. The 2 members of the opposing team scrambled around, ducking and diving out of the path of the speeding Super Ball as best they could, but it only got harder to avoid. It glanced off one wall, suddenly striking one of them with such a force that it caused his leg to burst. Blood spattered the squeaky floor of the court, tiny fragments of bone sent in all directions as the man screamed in pain, falling over only to be the latest contestant eliminated from the game. SCP-018 eventually reached enough velocity to hit the wall hard enough that it became buried in the resultant crater it indented. Lee cautiously looked up, seeing one other contestant left, one of the older contestants who had made it this far by sheer luck. The elderly man had taken a nasty fall while trying to avoid the anomalous dodgeball, and Lee immediately got up to help him to his feet. The 2 men offered each other a look of exhausted resignation, only to be startled as an MTF trooper marched into the room, carrying a pizza box. He threw the box down onto the ground between the two men. On its lid was a scrawled warning, "Careful, invisible knife in box." Lee breathed a heavy pained sigh as he looked across at the old man, both of them knowing that this final game would somehow be the cruelest. Now go check out Is This Show More Horrifying Than Squid Game's SCP-024 Game Show of Death and POV of SCP D-Class Revealed for more.